Just remind us before we get going, how big a player is Australia now in LNG exports?
Well, good morning, Andrew, and thanks for having me on. In the fall of 2018, Australia became the largest LNG producer in the world, surpassing Qatar for a short period. I don't believe they still are, but they have been a player in the global LNG trade for a long time. Australia has a large resource-based economy as Canada does, and they're in the Pacific Rim. Their clients are in the Pacific Rim. They also have a lot of their LNG resources offshore, so it's right there to be transported to markets.
But they had teething troubles, the Australians, as they got their huge facilities up and running. Tell us some of the problems that they've had.
Well, there's several problems. The first thing that occurred was the rapid build out of LNG projects, and coupled with the rising price of commodities in the first part of the first decade of the millennium, caused costs to rise, cost of labor to rise, and the Australian dollar was very strong. So not only were they fighting against a high-priced Australian dollar, the commodities like steel were hard to acquire. They did not, in the early days of Australian development, the EPCs were able to dictate the price of steel, and it was hard to manage projects efficiently given inputs and the cost of labor.
What's an EPC, sorry?
Engineering and procurement contract.
Oh, that's interesting. So they did have massive cost overruns. And there's also been tension within Australia, hasn't there? Because the populations over there in the east of the country, in the southeast. Go ahead.
If I could just give you a little bit of overview. As I stated, the most important thing to realize about Australian LNG and its export is all states inside the Commonwealth touch the ocean. So they can all export LNG without any kind of cross-border tension or pushback such as we have in Canada between, say, provinces. So that's the first great positive. The second thing is they have, as I stated earlier, a lot of their reserves are offshore, the Northern Territory and Western Australia. Having said that, they have a large resource of coal seam gas, which we would call CBM, coal bed methane, in Eastern Australia. And they started to, when they built their export facilities on the East Coast, they started drawing on those land-based reserves, causing shortages and price spikes in their internal pricing of natural gas for consumption and their own industries. So that is a definite, there on the map you see on the east, there's lots of gas, coal seam gas in the eastern states, but they've entered into long-term contracts with Asian buyers to ship LNG from those points up in the northeast corner there. And meanwhile, they have shortages inside the country for gas. This led to the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull setting up a task force to maybe dictate to the producers that we're going to put a holdback on shipping internal gas as export. Having said that, to get export contracts, you have to sign long-term deals generally because the buyer needs security of supply. Further to that, in several of the Australian states, they put moratoriums on drilling, so this even further hampered the ability to create new reserves.
Kelly, I mean, we got this news that the Russians and Chinese are now moving ahead with shipments on their huge pipeline where the Russians are shipping gas to the Chinese. So does this mean that a large chunk of the Chinese market is going to go to Mr. Putin and his colleagues? Is that diminishing the prospects of other people who'd like to sell gas to China?
I'll be frank, time is of the essence. The Chinese expect to increase their LNG imports by 30% from today by 2030. The Australians are already big suppliers to China. Canada has an opportunity to participate in this global LNG trade, but we have to keep moving and moving at a fairly expedient clip, or we will miss this market.
Why is that? I mean, because it's a glutted market, there's so many players?
I think that it's very hard to continue to explain to the folks that, you know, when there looks like a perceived glut of natural gas, that there's all kinds of players out there over the next half decade. But by the middle of the next decade, when LNG Canada brings its first train on, the market should be pretty much in balance, and they'll be looking for more new projects. So I may be a bit over the top to say that we'll miss the, let's call it the LNG train, but we certainly have to stay active and keep moving forward, because there is the LNG is the transition fluid to fuel to a lower carbon energy spectrum, and you know, Canada has giant world-class resources in the Montney, the Duvernay, Horn River, Liard Basin. All we need is pipeline connectivity to the coasts, and we should be able to be a significant participant in the trade.
It looks as though the opposition to gas pipelines is less than the opposition to oil pipelines. Is that your take on the environmental opposition and opposition among some Indigenous communities?
There's always going to be opposition. There's those on the most distressing part of the whole energy narrative today for me is the polarity and real bipolarity in the debate. Therefore, the narrative gets skewed, and it's unfortunate. Having said that, I would agree with you that there is less pushback or proposed opposition to natural gas. You know, it's the light end of the product stream. The guest you had on before, as I was watching, you're talking about crude oil, condensate, natural gas. That's the far end of the spectrum, and let's not forget, it is a fossil fuel. Having said that, it's the lightest, less GSG intensive fossil fuel. So those factors, I guess, would lead to less opposition. And you know, in the interim here, the last segment about the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Canadians know how to build pipelines. The Coastal GasLink will probably surpass the Trans Mountain in specificity to potential problems with pipelines. I'm very confident that we'll get gas to the coast, and they'll add a second train. I was just in London at a conference about LNG talking to U.S. investors, and Alfred Sorensen of Paraday Exploration was on talking about the potential to ship gas from the East Coast.
Yeah.
So we're in a pretty sweet spot here if we can just continue to capitalize. If I could just add too, Andrew, you know, this morning's, looking at my news feed this morning, you know, there seems to be a sort of a thawing around provincial relations with the premiers at their meetings. Premier Horgan's taken a page straight out of former Premier Christy Clark's playbook about LNG and the lower emission and more. I hate to use the term greener, but you know, using hydropower to power the LNG facilities does lead to a lower GHG molecule for shipment. So there's a couple of things I'd like to touch on about Australia.
Kelly, we're going to have you back. I'm so sorry, but we're out of time. But you've been a great guest, and I hope you'll come back soon to talk about these LNG exports.
I'd love to come back and talk about a couple of the things that policy levers that Australia has that we could use.
That's a great theme. Kelly, thanks very much.